Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Ultimate Growth Experience. I'm really excited to be able to talk about this book. It's Dr. Henry Kissinger's On China. So in the last video, I referred to the monk debate in 2011, when Kissinger, Ferguson, David Lee, and Fareed Zakaria talked about the question of, does the 21st century belong to China? And it is still a unsolved question, I think. And reading this book is just fascinating. And I think Kissinger does a brilliant job of talking about his personal, not only his personal interactions with China during his time as a former Secretary of State for the United States, but also his understanding of Chinese history. So what Kissinger does in the very first 90 pages, you could say. So for the first 90 pages goes from the very beginning of China to the period of Mao. And through those very delicate way of explaining Chinese history, Kissinger defines Chinese foreign policy, their ideology, and how they have always viewed themselves. So Kissinger says that China has always viewed themselves as the center of the universe, that everyone else who deals with them, aka people from the Western world or other places, were barbarians, because they were the top economic and political power prior to the Opium War. And so Chinese have always had strong Confucian traditions, and there are multiple books that Kissinger refers to. For instance, Sun Tsu's Art of War. The second is the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and also not just books like that, but also games. So I'll give an example. The Western world have operated in the idea of dominating and defeating opposition powers. And this is illustrated in chess, where you try to checkmate the king and destroy the queen, destroy the pawns and the knights, etc. But in Chinese foreign policy, this is sort of illustrated through Go, the game where you try to encircle your opponent. So if there's black marbles and white marbles, the winner are the ones that encircle the best. And this is the idea of incremental, pragmatic operation of foreign policy. And this strategy Kissinger defines as Wei Kui. And this is the center point as to how we can understand China's operation today. Kissinger also goes on to talk about Western engagement with China. For instance, Lord Palmerston and other foreign secretaries of the British Empire have tried multiple times in engaging with Chinese emperors, but they've always flatly rejected their proposal of starting a foreign embassy and having a far more international trade and geopolitical relationships with China, because China said no, because they said, well, you guys are barbarians, why should we deal with you? And as a result, despite multiple attempts by Queen Victoria and prior British dynasties, they finally said enough is enough, and we know what happened. The Opium War happened. And so that period till around 1949 was defined by a lot of Chinese scholars as the century of humiliation. And the Chinese still think about that. They are not happy about the fact that the West dominated them and humiliated them in that manner. But there are multiple reasons. According to Kissinger, the Chinese dynasties during the 18th and 17th century were not aware that America was facing the Industrial Revolution. They were facing scientific revolutions and other forms of technological advancement. And despite the fact that the West were telling the Chinese, hey, we are getting better than you, can you please engage with us? It was the fact that China did not, or they refused to do so because they thought that they were superior. Like I said, China views itself as the Middle Kingdom. They have operated foreign policy in a manner of osmosis, or the idea is that, okay, if you accept and want to learn from China and China's way of doing things, then we are your friend. And this is exemplified by the development of Vietnam, to a degree Korea, where I was born before. And I can see why that even within me, I have a lot of Confucian elements within myself. And those are the reasons, because of the history behind it. But anyway, So Kissinger defines Chinese foreign policy and the history of their operations, and also they have this um, sort of, you could say, geostrategic you can say complications, yeah, because China wanted to survive, and the question is how did they maintain their centralization of itself, despite Western imperialism, and the reason is because they had a strategy called barbarians against barbarians, where you make sure that, for instance, Western powers like Britain, French, the Dutch, Germans, all were going against each other, which creates a sort of like a balance of power structure within the barbarians who are trying to take over you. So that's how China was able to survive. And from that point on, um, Kissinger talks about the nationalist movement led by Chiang Kai-shek, and also the the rise of communism within China, and that leads us to Mao Zedong in 1940. So up to that point, about 90 pages. The following point on goes from all the way from Mao Zedong to around 2011, which was when the book was published. So regarding Mao, whom Kissinger met multiple times with personal interactions and engagement, because Kissinger himself was obviously the former Secretary of State for the United States under Nixon, but also someone who was involved within the White House for 10 different presidents. Um, and so Kissinger defines Mao as having, I mean, he saw himself as a philosopher, and Mao saw himself as a philosopher, a thinker, and always had really, because there are complications within himself, a lot of dilemmas. Um, because Mao was a committed communist, he wanted to create a state, a Chinese state, which followed the criteria set out by Karl Marx, and he was a complete ideologue and radical. But at the same time, Mao had another view. He was a Sino-centric pragmatist and a realist, and he was in this, you could say, psychological dilemma with himself, in the sense that he's like, well, I don't want to deal with the Americans, but if I don't, then the country's not going to survive. And so that's why Mao has always had this thing back and forth with himself. And this is emblematic even today in Chinese politics. When I think of, for instance, the Li Keqiang faction, which is the moderate faction that was led by Deng Xiaoping, and then the radical faction, or the far more, ideological faction led by current President Xi Jinping. But but regarding Mao, Kissinger just viewed him having these dilemmas, and he was a very complex man. Yes, he caused a lot of trouble. For instance, look at the Cultural Revolution. That was just an absolute disaster. The Little Red Book that he tried to propagate, purging his enemies, and the thing is, despite what people say about China, even though it's not a democracy, it's a one-party state, there are factions, and the question is which faction wins. And following in from Mao, um, Zhao Enlai was not able to take over because he got purged by Mao, obviously. But okay, Zhao Enlai was the foreign minister for the Chinese, like throughout the whole of that period, from the 1949 to around the 1970s. And Zhao, according to Kissinger, was a pragmatist who focused on order and order rather than chaos. And because of him, Mao was not able to be as radical as it could be, because Zhao held him to account through different means, not overtly confronting Mao, but as a friend and ally and a loyalist to Mao. But Zhao himself was far more pragmatic and sensible, and he knew that if China continued to isolate itself from the rest of the world, then China would not be able to survive. And this is where the key man that was involved in the revival of China, Deng Xiaoping, comes in. Kissinger loved and revered Deng Xiaoping, because Deng Xiaoping was the one that deregulated and opened its markets to the rest of the world. And this is the point, is that Kissinger said that Deng was a complete pragmatist and part of the moderate wing. Even though he was with Mao in the 1940s, Deng Xiaoping was a free marketeer who defined it as socialism with Chinese characteristics, even though it's obviously to me and others that this is just him saying, look, we need to open up and be far more innovative within ourselves. We have lost so much by being isolated, and we have a lot to learn from the rest of the world. And the one country that Deng Xiaoping looked to revive the Chinese economy was Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew and Deng Xiaoping got involved geopolitically and had numerous conversations as to how to get the Chinese spirit up again. It's because of Lee Kuan Yew. I mean, Deng was inspired by Lee Kuan Yew's domestic policies. And Kissinger defined Deng as one of the most remarkable men possible regarding China, and Deng had so many complications because, from the 1970s, you had the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was being hostile to them, and at the same time, Americans were sort of de facto allying with them, but at the same time, this trilemma of great powers going against each other, right? And for Deng to be able to maneuver around that well, at the same time trying to drive his people to getting educated, to getting smarter, to taking in foreign direct investment, and understanding that central planning has failed, and the idea of the Great Leap Forward has. And at the same time, Deng had to deal with a huge radical faction that wanted to overthrow him because he was seen as a rightist within the Chinese Communist Party. So through all of those things, at the same time, facing the end of the Soviet Union in 1989, the Tiananmen Square, and as a liberal myself, I hate it. I hate the fact that the Chinese are not are not advocates of human rights like the Americans. They don't believe in individual freedom, but at the same time, when I put myself in the shoes of Deng Xiaoping, I completely understand as to why he decided to crack down on Tiananmen, because he knew that if the CCP fell, it's the end of China, as in you face anarchy, no order, because Deng and the moderates, their core principle is order. And facing all of those challenges, and with that, entering the World Trade Organization in 2001, geopolitical complications dealing with the Americans in light of this. And Kissinger explained this so eloquently, and I gotta say, guys, have a read of this because it gives you so much insight as to why Chinese foreign policy is engaged in this such complex manner. It's not like the Americans, where the Americans' view is, described by Francis Fukuyama in his book, The End of History, right? The End of History and the Last Man. They want to spread liberal democracy in a universal manner, whereas what China wants is to be the number one power in the world again. They're not trying to be a hegemon, but at the same time, they sort of are. But they want to be, they feel like that they've been humiliated through the century of humiliation, and they just want to say, hey, we are number one. We are number one: science, technology, education, living standards, all of these things. And Kissinger says this is the reason why that China has operated in this manner in foreign policy. And I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so, it's about 13 minutes now, isn't it? The key question today, and Kissinger says this in this foreword and also the final chapter, is that will China and the United States get into conflict? And his answer is, I hope not. And he advocates for a Pacific alliance in the sense of with the two great powers finding common ground on issues such as climate change, on nuclear destruction, nuclear devastation, and other issues such as pollution, etc. Kissinger says that there needs to be a way where the Americans and the Chinese can cooperate, because his fear is facing another World War I situation when an insurging Germany and the incumbent British went to war through World War I. And Kissinger does not want that. So he said the only way is to have a co-evolutionary international order. That's what he specifically said. And when I think about that, Kissinger himself is a realist, as in he always said pragmatism, being very meticulous with the way that you operate foreign policy. He's not an ideologue. I mean, Kissinger himself, he did his PhD at Harvard over you know, the in his book The World Restored, that's basically his PhD thesis, but he was also fascinated by Kant. Kissinger himself is a Machiavellian realist who is also Kantian. Kissinger refers to the idea of having perpetual peace. He thinks that he wishes this would be the case. He's worried about the potential competition that may go on between the United States and China, and his view is that the only way to resolve this is through co-evolution within the two great powers. I'm not sure about that argument. I read John J. Mearsheimer's book, The Great Delusion, and his view is that China will not rise peacefully. Kissinger's view is that he hopes it does. And like he said at the debates, he says in the book that China has new demographic problems as a result of the one child policy. It has hundreds of millions of people still in abject poverty. As the Chinese economy continues to grow, they need to have an adjustment period in facing domestic turmoil as a result of more people getting out of poverty and into the middle class. And so he says that China is too obsessed with its domestic problems to be able to try and compete with the United States. That's Kissinger's view. Although he wrote this in 2011, I'm not really sure what he thinks about it now. In fact, I think as he said as he talked with Neil Ferguson recently in a Bloomberg conference, he said that it's a new Cold War. But reading this in hindsight was really fascinating, and I've come to really appreciate Chinese history a lot more. And and I get the sense that Xi Jinping is not really leading China in the right direction, because Deng would not be happy about the way that the 10-year term rule got removed, the fact that Xi Jinping is a de facto leader. Deng was far more humanitarian and really wanted to run a competent meritocratic style of governance, sort of in lines with the Singaporean model. And so yeah, it's a really, really great book. I highly recommend it. And thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen. I highly recommend Kissinger's book on China, because it reading this in hindsight was just so insightful. And China is a country that I have tremendous respect for, because as a sort of Confucius disciple, you could say, being someone with a Korean background. But yes, give it a read, because it will give you huge insights as to what's going on in China, and how they industrialized, and why. Oh, and here's another thing is, why did the Americans have so much complication of the Taiwan? Because of the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, the Americans wanted to contain the Soviet Union, and they had a de facto, cooperative relationship with China. And China said Taiwan is the only issue that they had problems with the Americans. That's the reason why even today Taiwan's such a big issue, and obviously the North Koreans. But yeah, I would say give it a read. Give it your best shot. I hope I summed up the book okay, but I've really enjoyed it, and it was really, really good. So thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for watching. If you haven't, subscribe. I'll do some more book reviews, and hope you all have a good day. Take care.